Hey, my name is Shovel. The name of the channel is Shovel, and this video is about the Ford 3.8 liter Mustang IQ test. I wrote a couple of scripts to try to do this video because I wanted to be complete and thorough and leave no stone unturned, and then I realized you're probably watching this while you're sitting down on the toilet. You don't have time for all that. So I'm going to try and make it a little bit faster than I was going to. We do need a little bit of backstory on the 3.8 Mustang. And as you can see, I've got two 3.8 liter Mustangs right here in my garage. They've got the same motor, set up a little bit different, and that's going to become relevant a little bit later on in this video. The context that I think is important to share, even though it's going to take a moment to talk about, is when this motor was developed originally was the end of the 70s, beginning of the 1980s. And if you're watching this and you weren't around back then, that's cool. But the way that that worked at that point was that most families would drive themselves around in a sedan. That was the typical way that, you'd have a person who could afford a house with a single income in their family, and they would drive the kids around and the wife around or whatever. The speed limit back then in the US was 55 miles an hour nationwide. So for the era that this engine was originally developed in, it was developed to just chug along quietly on the highway, and most importantly, to be dirt cheap to manufacture. That's why it's the entry-level engine in the Ford Mustang, and it's also the entry-level engine in the Ford F100, which is what they called the F-150 back then. So now that you have that context, that the purpose of the motor was to chug along slow on the highway with real shallow differential gearing and be real cheap to manufacture, the other nice kind of convenient part about fitting into a Mustang, and probably why that already kind of old engine got pushed into this car, is because instead of being the geometrically superior 60-degree V6, it was a 90-degree V6, which is shorter and fits under a low hood better. So now that we have that history kind of out of the way, let's talk about the engines themselves, and specifically about the IQ test, because that's really the focus of this video. So let's take a gander at them real quick, just to get us on the same page. This is the earlier generation version of it, so you can kind of see what's going on there. You don't really have to know too much about what's going on for this part of the video, but this is the earlier generation. This is the later generation, and you might notice it's a little bit different, especially this big aluminum part right here looks very different on this one. This one makes about 50 more horsepower than that one, despite being fundamentally the same engine. All right, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put you back up here for a minute because that's going to be easier for us to have this chat. The first part of this IQ test, we're going to think of it like just putting your name on the top of the paper. You get like 20 points for that. It's kind of like that test that they give to people right after they had a stroke just to make sure they're okay, make sure they can go home and feed themselves and all that stuff. We all started somewhere. There's all stuff we don't know yet. So, let's just have this friendly conversation on it. Why do you have an SN95 with a V6 engine in the first place? If you inherited it from someone else, that's a reason. If you bought it because it was cheap and you just want a car that looks pretty and is fun to drive, cool, thumbs up, you're winning so far. If you bought it because you're like, I'm gonna make it fast, you might have failed the IQ test before you even started, okay? These engines, like I mentioned, they were set up from the very beginning when they were first engineered to go chugging along the highway at low RPMs in a family sedan and have enough, grunt off a stoplight to move 5 butts forward, but they're not a sports car engine. And really, yes, you absolutely could, right? It's just like if you got 15 dudes that look just like me and you tried to make an NBA team out of us. I guess if you put enough money and effort into training and years of work and everything, we might be able to lose a few games, but you're starting from the wrong place. You're just starting from some place where it's way too much work to make it competitive, whatever the heck that means. So if your objective when you're buying a Mustang is that you're gonna like get the V6 and then hop it up, you're wasting your time, you're wasting your money. These are perfectly fine, but they're not that kind of car. They're not drag strip heroes. They're the entry-level engine, and it's so much cheaper to start with the GT. It's just so much cheaper and easier to start with something that already goes faster. Buy a Camry, buy something that left the factory with twice as much horsepower as this and is a family sedan, and you'll still be ahead versus trying to turn one of these things into a legitimately fast car. Now, I took this one here as a personal project because I wanted the challenge. I wanted to have something that started out from the very back and get it to the middle of the pack. I just wanted to prove that you could make it not suck. I think we're on the same page, hopefully, at this point, which is, for the very beginning of it, figure out what it is you actually want to do with the car, and if it's go fast, you simply got the wrong car. Move it off to someone else who's going to enjoy it for what it is and get yourself the car you really wanted in the first place. That's my advice. Now, if you stick around to the end, I will share with you my advice on how to make one of these actually pretty fast the fastest, shortest, quickest, most direct, cost-effective way possible. So we're past the entry-level part, right? We're past the are you okay, bro sort of thing. Let's talk about the second part of the IQ test, and that is observation skills. That is, what can you use your eyeballs to do in order to make the best decision you possibly can. And for that, we'll go look at the motors again. Something that you may have been guilty of yourself, don't feel bad about it. You got one of these cars and you're like, I want to make it fast. The internet tells me that I got to put one of those eBay intakes on it, right? You've seen the ones with the big like chrome tube here and the big open exposed filter and whatever. And that's going to make the car fast. And you done screwed up. You're already not starting out the right way. And the reason for that is this. You can use your observation skills. You don't need to actually know anything about cars at all. All you have to do is just use your peepers, figure this out for yourself. We've got this intake hose right here, and it goes to this air filter houser right here. And this car, remember, this left the factory making 145 horsepower. This left the factory making 193 horsepower. That's the same filter. And if you pop the hood on a 1995 Cobra R, that is the hot shit 5.8 liter race-specific car, same air filter. It flows plenty of air. That is not the bottleneck at all. So that's the observation part of it, sort of, is that if you went and bought one of those cold air intakes thinking it was going to make you a lot of power, you're not going to make, that's not where the bottleneck is. You're not going to make one pony power. Like I said, this motor is fundamentally the same. It's the same whole bottom end. This is the same rotating assembly, the same pistons, all that stuff. Same engine as that one, but this one makes 50 fewer horsepower. Now you can tell that this one has this intake plenum here. This is where the air gets into the engine. If you're not a gearhead, that's cool, but so the air gets in through this hose here, it gets in through the throttle body. That's what your gas pedal controls. It goes in here into this kind of plenum, which is a shared hallway basically for the air. And then it goes out through these little runners down into the individual pistons. And you can see that this one looks very different from this one over here. So that's an expensive aluminum casting. Plastic's cheap. If they wanted to make this air intake stuff, a lot better flowing or whatever, if that was going to make a difference, it's cheap as hell to make something out of plastic. Making a big aluminum casting, that costs money. Engineers don't want to, engineers want to spend money, but the folks they answer to don't want to spend money. So if they're putting this big, very heavy, very expensive aluminum thing on there to make more power, that's probably where a bunch of the power is coming in. So the observation that you can make from that is if you want to get more horsepower out of this engine, it probably has something to do with the air intake, but not the part that's before the throttle body. It's the part after the throttle body. Before we get ahead of ourselves, you might be thinking, well, hey, I can just take that intake and stick it on this car and make a shitload more horsepower, right? Well, kind of, but it's not as simple as that. This is mated to the heads that are on the engine. So you can't just take that intake and put it on this engine directly because it won't actually connect to the heads. These have much better flowing cylinder heads. You can take these cylinder heads and you can put them on that engine and you'll be making 30-ish horsepower just with nothing else, with literally nothing else. Just those heads and that intake on that engine, you'll get magically 30 extra horsepower. I don't advise that, which we'll talk about later, but you can do exactly that, and many people have. So that's one difference that you can kind of make an observation with your eyes that from the factory, they knew that they had to get more air into the engine, and they did that with a different intake manifold. In addition to those differences, there are a few other differences that aren't quite as visibly shocking, I guess you could say. Like they're not as apparent from the top. If you look through parts catalogs, you'll see that there's different fuel injectors between the two of them. Those are 14 pound per hour, and these are 19 pound per hour, I think. There's, different like timing assembly, different camshafts. Like they're not exactly the same engine because when they're engineered as a group of parts that all have to work nicely together. If you're getting more air into the engine, it stands to reason you're going to burn more fuel, and therefore you're going to need more fuel injector. So those parts, you just kind of have to like put them all into your spreadsheet in your head and kind of add them up, which ones make a difference in power or which ones are there to support something else that makes a difference in power. Something else you'll notice if you look really carefully is that there's actually more than one path by which air can get into each of the cylinders. So you can see these big long runners right here. There's 6 of them because there's 6 cylinders. But what's harder to see is there's also a short runner. Each one of the cylinders has a long and a short runner. So for example, the air comes in through here, through the throttle body, goes back up there to a balancing chamber that comes down through these 2 plenums right here. There's a plenum on either side. And so for example, for your first cylinder, the one right over here, you've got this long path that goes down to it, but you've also got a short path that goes down to it. And that's something that Ford calls, what do they call that? Intake manifold runner control, or IMRC on Fords. My Ram 1500 has it on its Hemi. A lot of cars have a method of controlling the length of the intake manifold runners, and that broadens your torque curve by a lot. There's something called acoustic supercharging. It's a little bit hard to explain, but it works kind of the same way that the bass port works on a subwoofer. It also works similar to when you're on a swing set and you're swinging and you kick your legs out at the right time. And if you kick your legs out at just the right time, you get a little boost. If you kick them out just randomly, you don't get anything out of it. That's very similar to what goes on in the intake manifold. You've got a valve that's opening up at a prescribed time at a certain RPM, and if you can have a high pressure wave at the back of the valve right as it opens, you get a little extra air inside the cylinder. If you've got an acoustic wave that's like bouncing back and forth in there, and when it opens up, you're at kind of a portion where there's less pressure, you get less air in the cylinder and the engine's less efficient. Since that can only be tuned for one specific frequency for a given volume of air, that means that if you only have one length of intake manifold runner, then there's only one RPM at which your engine is the most efficient. And anything above or below that, it's kind of getting what it can get. Since we've got multiple different lengths, that means that there's kind of two torque peaks, and in between, it splits the difference. On early versions of this engine, for example, the 99 and 2000 Mustangs, they actually just had both of those paths open all the time. They both open onto the back of the same valve, and they would just be open and kind of split the difference, not really get the best out of either one of them. And then as of 2001, I believe, they put the IMRC in there, which turns off the short one at low RPMs and then opens it up at higher RPMs. And that gives you much more efficient cruise. I think it gives you like 3% more peak torque. And then it also extends out your high RPM running by just a little tiny bit. So you get 3 peak horsepower, but your area under the curve is actually a lot better with the IMRC on there. So that's the stuff that you can get by observation. You don't necessarily need to be an engineer to figure out that there is something different about how the air gets into both of these cars, and that accounts for a lot of the difference in horsepower. Now let's look at a couple of more things that you can pick up from observation. You do have to look a little bit deeper to see these, but they are things that you can observe without being an engineer. Let's take a look. On this 96 Mustang, you can see the red line for the tachometer is at 4,750 RPM, give or take, right? It takes place before 5,000 RPM. It's done. It cuts off fuel. It stops doing anything above that RPM. On this 2002, you can see the rev limit has gone up like about 500 RPM, which isn't a ton, but that's a little clue. It lets us know a little something else is different. All of the New Edge V6 Mustangs came with 3.27 to 1 differential gears from the factory. I don't think there's any exceptions to that. The earlier ones with the single port engine, they came with 2.73 to 1 or 3.08 to 1, depending on which transmission they had. So that's a much shallower gear set, which means that the engine will be necessarily running at much lower RPMs for a given road speed and transmission gear. That's because, again, they knew that this was going to be a slow chugging engine. It would push you back in your seat just a little bit when you were leaving a stoplight, but it wouldn't pull those gears for a long time. It wouldn't rev out real fast on the highway, and you certainly wouldn't be able to do like events where you're staying at high RPMs all the time. The reason for that is something that's a little bit more subtle, and that's what we're going to get into before we transition into the last stage of this IQ test. Like I said before, these are fundamentally the same engine. The pistons are interchangeable, the rotating assembly is interchangeable, the blocks bolt in. It's the same engine, but it's not actually the same block casting. This one is externally balanced and this one is internally balanced, and it would take a really long time to explain why that is and what that difference means. But this one's internally balanced, which means this one is much smoother at higher RPMs. So if you're going to be running the engine consistently at higher RPM, remember we've got the split port intake that's made to give us torque peaks at a wider range of RPMs. We've got the deeper differential gears. We've got a much better breathing engine, and we've got an engine that's balanced at a higher RPM, and that enables the engine to be comfortable to use and run at those higher RPMs. And that is why this engine makes more horsepower than that one, despite being the same engine. That being said, we can take this information and we can still apply it. Is it possible to put the split port heads and the split port intake manifold on the older one? It is possible. It may not be something you actually have to do, but it is possible. Now let's go ahead and take a look underneath. What we can observe underneath here about the exhaust system is that it has, of course, the exhaust coming down from one of the banks of cylinders, and then it goes back to a Y pipe, and then it comes down from the other bank of cylinders, and that goes back to a Y pipe. Now this part might be a little bit difficult to see from here. Hopefully I can zoom in a little bit and give you a better look at it. That right there is the Y pipe, and I'll get my finger out of the way so it'll focus. And you can see that that is a stamped formed piece where it is deliberately trying to bring those two exhaust, pulses or whatever, together real smoothly right there.
Now, I no longer have the stock Y-pipe installed on my older SN95, so I wouldn't be able to share that with you quite as well, but I promise you the one on that car is not as nicely done as this one. So it's pretty obvious when you compare them side by side with each other that Ford put a little bit more effort into doing the Y-pipe on this car here, and that's a clue. Coming back here to the middle of the car, you can see this is that Y-pipe that we looked at earlier. It goes to this little flange that ties into the rest of the exhaust from there on back. And this is a 2¼ inch exhaust pipe all the way out. On the older car, this equivalent was a 2-inch pipe. So that's another thing we can see that they changed. They increased the diameter of that pipe a little bit because they knew that it was going to be making more horsepower and flowing more exhaust out. On my 96, you can see it's a little bit different because I've installed a mid pipe right here that allows me to connect a GT catback to this. So that means that each cylinder bank has its own path all the way back. So it starts with 2¼ inch pipe down to the H pipe there, and then that goes to 2½ inch pipe the rest of the way out. Originally, though, it came together kind of crudely to a Y-pipe, and that Y-pipe went to 2-inch tubing all the way out. And if you run a calculator for exhaust tubing size on the internet, of which there are tons and tons of different calculators, they all more or less agree that 2-inch pipe is only good enough for about 140, 150 horsepower. That's the limit. And since this engine made 145 horsepower stock, that meant that you were right at the limit of what that exhaust could do with that engine. And if you wanted to make any more power from the engine, you had to give it a more free-flowing exhaust. And not just simply a different muffler, but actually give it more pipe to flow through too.
That calculation about the exhaust tubing diameter versus the amount of horsepower it supports brings us to part 3 of the IQ test, and that is plausibility. Plausibility has to do with kind of like your BS detector. Whenever someone's trying to sell you something or convince you of something, that goes for me too. If I'm trying to tell you something that doesn't make sense, check it for plausibility. Plausibility is kind of like that intake thing we were talking about earlier, where Ford did not see fit to change the air filter assembly when going from the base model 3.8 liter 145 horsepower engine to the race-ready Cobra R with the 5.8 liter engine. It's the same filter, which means the filter probably flows enough air because Ford would have changed that if it would have made a difference. So if someone's trying to sell you an air filter assembly, it probably won't do anything because why would it? That's not where the bottleneck is. Similarly though, if you've got something like someone's trying to sell you a chip or a tune or a tuner or whatever, you got to wonder, like, what's the tuner actually going to do? There's not variable cam timing, there's not variable intake geometry on these guys, and there's not much of it on these guys. There's not throttle by wire, there's not direct injection, there's not coil unplug. There's not really a whole lot of levers for that software to pull. Like, there's not a whole lot of things it can really do. It can change ignition timing a little bit, it can change fuel air to fuel ratio a little bit, but not really a whole lot else. And so those aren't going to give you a ton of extra power. And if you look at the fine print on them when they say they give you more horsepower, most of the time it's because they raise the rev limit a little bit. And we know that if something's still making the same amount of torque but spinning faster, then it's going to make higher horsepower. So they can sit there and claim it makes 10 more horsepower. It doesn't make it everywhere. It only makes it because it extended the RPM up a little bit. That's not much. Like, the plausibility there is there anything that a tune could actually do in order to change how much air and fuel burns inside the engine? And if the problem is there's not enough air, then the answer is not really. There's your plausibility. Now, you can't be expected to be a human calculator and figure all this stuff out all the time. I'm certainly not. There's tools for that. Let's go ahead and check out some tools that we can use to kind of plausibility check this. For the first one of these, we're just going to look at exhaust tubing calculators. So we're going to go ahead and click on Google and skimpy Olympic uniforms. Well, maybe we'll look at that instead. No, I'm just kidding. All right, let's go ahead and type in here exhaust. Oh, I can't even type. So I just typed in exhaust tubing calculator horsepower. Hopefully that's enough words. How to determine proper exhaust tubing size. We'll open that in a new tab, and we'll go ahead and open up a couple more in a new tab because you never know. There might be really dumb ones. So let's go ahead and click here. And this has, just a nice little chart. So we can see here engine displacement. That's probably going to be in cubic inches if I'm reading this right. We're going to look at number of horsepower and pipe diameter for single exhaust and pipe diameter for dual exhaust. So here you don't even really need to run it through a calculator. You can just kind of look at this cheat sheet here. So we know that we have a 232 cubic inch engine. So that's 200 to 250, and it makes about 150 horsepower. And that means for a single exhaust system, it should be 2.25 inches. We know that the SN95 had a 2-inch exhaust system, and so that's already too small for this amount of horsepower. We know that it needed at least 2¼ inches, and that makes it real plausible that a change to the exhaust system is going to change the amount of horsepower you have available. You might even go bigger. But this gives you a really quick way of just
telling how much horsepower do I think I'm going to make, and is my exhaust sufficient. Let's go ahead and take a look at another one. So what's this one here? Exhaust size pipe calculator. So if I say that the engine makes 145 horsepower from the factory, this tells me some exhaust velocity stuff, and we actually don't really need to care that much about this, but it tells us that we need 2.02 inches internal to make that much power. So that's pretty close to what the other one had said, right? It's slightly over 2, we round up. 2.25 inches sounds pretty plausible for the internal exhaust diameter. Yeah, this is a video game. This is a game called Automation, and this is not like a real simulation. Again, we're not trying to land rockets on Mars. We're just simply trying to take an old car and figure out the most direct route to make it work as well as it can without wasting money or being silly. So this video game is based on real physics, and you may not be able to enter precise things like the exact cam profile that your engine has or anything like that. But if you input all the stuff that you know for sure, like your bore and stroke and what your compression ratio is and that kind of stuff, then you tweak what's not quite as intuitive with it until you end up with a torque and horsepower curve that roughly resembles the real engine, which you can usually find by just Googling dyno sheets and looking for other people's dyno results. Once you have a dyno graph that resembles the engine based upon the real world information that you've been able to input for it, then you can use this simulator to figure out what it's not quite doing well enough and why the torque starts falling off at a certain point. So let's go ahead and run this thing through and figure out what we can learn from it. What I'll do here is I'm going to go ahead and click start to start the engine, and I'm going to give the throttle all of everything, and then we're going to raise the RPM target, and we're going to take a look at this thing over here where it says flow bench. So when we start revving this thing up and we get up to the torque peak right here, torque peak is going to say, you know what, the intake manifold is being asked for 111% of its, whatever they want to call that, the amount of flow that it's being used. What does that look like? Does that remind you of something that we talked about earlier in this video? It also shows us the exhaust is restricted a little bit. What does that look like? Does that remind us of something we looked at earlier in this video? And then as we run this thing up to the actual horsepower peak, you can see the torque is falling off, but the revs are going up. And so we'll run this up to the horsepower peak, which is close to 4,000 RPM, give or take. Let's go ahead and just bump that down. And remember, this is similar to the specs that we see here. 150 at 4,000 RPM. Well, we didn't get the 150 target exactly right, but we got the peak at 4,000. And here the intake manifold is being asked for 148% of its maximum, and the exhaust is being asked for 140% of its maximum. Let's go ahead and stop this, and then we'll go ahead and click on exhaust down here, and we'll say that we're going to do dual exhaust, and we're also going to make them dual 2¼ inch exhaust. And that more closely represents the 96 Mustang I've got out there. So we'll go back over here to this little dyno page, and we'll go ahead and start it, and we'll run the throttle at full scale, and we'll run this back up to 4,000 RPM, and you can see that the torque peak has already gone up a little bit, and also the horsepower peak has gone up a little bit. So we'll run up to 4,000 RPM, and now you can see the exhaust is not being taxed at all. We got plenty of exhaust flow. We're being choked off on intake, but we've got plenty of exhaust flow here. That gave us a little bit more peak horsepower. Now I don't know exactly how much, but it gave us a little bit more than we had before. Here I've made my best effort in a few minutes of the new Edge Mustang's V6, and you can see here that this is a much flatter torque curve. So it makes almost the same torque from around 3,000 to around 4,500 before it starts really dropping off. And you can see that the torque peak takes place, in this case, at 3,600 RPM. If we look up the real engine, it's supposed to have its torque peak here at 2,750. But because of the variable intake geometry, we are realistically going to have this nice, flat, continuous torque curve. We like to see that. We want to see it even wider than that if possible. So let's go ahead and just follow along here. We'll go through all the different things. There's not much to look at because, again, these are just my best effort at simulating the real engine with these limited controls. One thing you can see is, just like on the real car, the rev limit has been raised to 5,300 RPM instead of the 4,800 or 4,750 that the single port engine has. Then we'll go ahead and go to the testing page, and I'll start the engine. And let's go ahead and put this on the power and torque thing. We'll put the throttle all the way to full scale, and we'll go ahead and rev the RPMs up to that 2,750. We'll go ahead and move that back down here to 2,750, like where the actual engine is supposed to be here. And you can see that at the torque peak of this engine, or at least the torque peak of the real engine, we're not anywhere close to taxing out the intake manifold or the exhaust. There's plenty left there. We'll go ahead and run this up to its claimed torque peak. So we'll go ahead and put that right here. And here at this simulation's torque peak,
we're using up everything the exhaust has, and we're using up most of what the intake manifold has. And that seems pretty realistic to the real car, which informs us potentially on the split port Mustangs that there might be a little bit of horsepower hiding in the exhaust. You might be able to get a bit more power out of it by changing your exhaust up a little bit. Let's go ahead and run the revs up to the horsepower peak, which we see here is over 5,000 RPM. So up here at the horsepower peak, we can see that we're taxing the intake manifold quite a bit, and we're also taxing the exhaust quite a bit. Let's go ahead and stop this, and we'll go ahead and give it a better exhaust. So we know that we've got tubular mid headers. It actually doesn't have tubular headers. It has kind of crappy log headers on it. They're steel, but they're like not headers. They're manifolds. Anyway, we'll go ahead and just leave it at that. My wife's actually does have tubular headers on it. That's one of the changes that car has. But let's go ahead and do a dual exhaust on it, and we'll still do that. We'll still do baffled exhaust, and we'll just make it 2.5 inches. Now let's go ahead and run that simulation again. So we'll go ahead and start it, and we'll run throttle full scale, and we'll go back up to that torque peak. And at that torque peak, we can see that we're not even close to using up everything the exhaust has. We're still using up everything the intake manifold has to offer, but we're not anywhere close to taxing the exhaust. Now we'll go ahead and run the RPMs up to the horsepower peak. And here's where we can see the intake manifold is still kind of robbing us of a little bit, but we got plenty of exhaust going on there. So that means that on that engine, there might be a bit to be had with that. We can also see if we go ahead and stop this, that our peak horsepower is now 197 as opposed to the 190, whatever it was before. There's a wasp over there that keeps messing with me, so I apologize if I freak out. Anyways, that's the Ford 3.8 IQ test in 3 steps, right? Do your plans make any financial sense whatsoever? Because if you just want to go really fast, V6 Mustangs are a terrible place to start from. You're going to spend a ton of money to make it legitimately fast. That doesn't mean that it's a waste of money to improve them. It just means that you got to figure out like what your ceiling is. And if you want 300 plus horsepower, it's pretty hard. You can do it. It's pretty hard. If you want 300 plus horsepower, get a different car. Second part of it is do what the Ford engineers did. Just copy off their notes. Don't reinvent the wheel. They took that engine and they made it into that engine. They gave it 50 extra horsepower. Copy what they did. Boom, you got 50 extra horsepower. No brainer right there, right? Third part, how plausible are your plans? Is there a way you can calculate or simulate or estimate using real world numbers the thing that you plan on doing? Is it actually going to have a mechanism by which it can function? Because if there's not a mechanism by which it can function, if you can't back it up with some sort of calculation, some existing data, then you're just experimenting at that point. Experimenting is expensive and doesn't always work out the way you want it to. So the next part, this is the part that you probably are most interested in. How do you take one of these cars and make it fast, as cheap, as easy, as cost-effective as possible? And I think I got a couple answers for you on that one. The first one, the lowest hanging fruit, the thing I would advise to everybody is dual exhaust. Just go to a true dual exhaust if you can. That's the lowest hanging fruit. You will feel the difference. I'm not even talking about hearing. I don't actually care that much about loud exhaust. I prefer it a little bit quieter myself. But you're going to feel the difference in how much power you have, especially at higher RPM. So if you especially have a manual transmission and you're like winding out those gears and feeling it pull, you're going to feel it pull a lot harder just by letting the exhaust get the heck out of the engine. And that goes for either one of these. That goes for either one of these cars. A little bit more so for this one, but it goes for either one of them. The second part is, if you have a little bit more money to spend and you're thinking turbocharger, supercharger, whatever, don't even bother with that. Get yourself the engine out of a 2000 to 2008 Ford F-150, a 4.2 liter engine. It's that block. It's this block with the balance shaft, but stroked out to 4.2 liters and with a much better air intake assembly. Those make 250 foot-pounds of torque stock, and they make like 230 horsepower stock. Along with a decent flowing exhaust, you'll be making like 265 foot-pounds of torque and maybe 250 horsepower without really any heroics. And since it stays naturally aspirated, you get to enjoy that build of power that you get from a lightweight car, because these are pretty lightweight cars. Doing that will cost you about what a turbo costs, but it's a much better outcome in my opinion. The next thing you can do after you've done those things is get yourself the rear axle out of a 2003 to 2004 Mustang Mach 1. Those axles have 3.55 to 1 differential gears, and they also have a limited slip differential, and they've got the big brakes on them. So you get a couple of upgrades in one. If you're doing one on one of these cars, a couple things to be aware of is, first, they are 40 millimeters wider total, which means it pushes the wheels out 20 millimeters further. You get fitment like that instead of the tucked in look that they normally have. You also are able to run quad shocks if you want to. And the other thing to be aware of is that they do use a different set of lower control arms on these versus those. The bolts are slightly different in size. So you'll want to get the lower control arms that fit with the New Edge Mustang if you're putting a New Edge axle on an early SN95. Other than that, of course, you'll have to correct your speedometer for it. You can do that with a gear on the manual versions of these. You have to buy an electronic box for it for the automatic versions of these, and you can use a tuner for these to correct your gear ratio so your speedometer reads accurately. What that does for you is these left the factory with a 2.73 to 1 or a 3.08 to 1 differential ratio. These left the factory with a 3.27 to 1 differential ratio. By changing the differential ratio, you're increasing the amount of torque available in any given gear. You're also shortening the RPM range at which that gear is usable within the power band of the car, which is why you don't necessarily want to go too high on gear ratio. Like people will sometimes say go to 4 to 1, like 4.11 or whatever differential gears. And when you do that, especially with a manual, you're going to be shifting back and forth a lot because each gear becomes a lot less versatile. And so for a street-driven car, whether it's you're driving back and forth to work, you're road tripping, if it's a car you actually drive on the roads, I wouldn't go to 4 anything. It becomes pretty undrivable. And that's before we talk about highway RPM, which is also kind of annoying. Just driving it, though, kind of sucks. Going to 3.55 to 1, I think that's like about a 9% difference, if I'm not mistaken, from the factory 3.27s, which means that in first gear, you get like 9% more torque to the ground. And in any other given gear, you get 9% more torque to the ground, while your RPMs only go up by 9% on the highway. Your gear range becomes 9% narrower. I think that's a great compromise. On these guys here, if you're starting from a 2.73 to 1 and you go to 3.55 to 1, I think that's like a 27% difference, which is actually pretty significant, and that's as far as I would push it. I actually put 3.27 to 1 diff gears in this one on purpose because I actually think that fits the engine better than 3.55s. But again, if we're talking about putting the F-150 engine in, then you'll probably want to go to 3.55s if you can. So that's my advice. If you're thinking about spending turbo money or whatever, skip the turbo, put the F-150 engine. You're going to have better result. It's going to be a lot easier to achieve the amount of horsepower you're looking for. And then if you still need more on top of that, I guess spend the money on a turbo, but then you should have just bought a GT or a faster car. Again, we're back to square one again. Anyway, if you have any questions or comments or whatever, leave them down below. That's what the commentary is for. And if you want more information on this kind of subject, ask me for it. Maybe I'll make a video. Thanks.